It was a cold December night in 2023 at Villa Montemayor in Madrid when Carlos Mendoza, a 38-year-old night janitor and single father to a 12-year-old daughter, walked into the main living room for cleaning duty, and came face to face with Isabel Herrera, Spain's most ruthless multi-billionaire, sitting motionless in her luxury wheelchair. She fixed him with that razor-sharp stare that had ruined careers and empires, expecting the usual subservience from staff. But when Carlos, acting with the ease of a man who'd raised a disabled daughter for years, knelt in front of her and simply said, "I'll help you walk again," Isabel burst into cruel laughter that echoed through the entire villa. "You, a mere janitor, think you can help me?" But when Carlos started telling her about his daughter Lucia, paralyzed since birth, and how he'd watched her take her first steps at age 10 thanks to a miraculous mix of love, determination, and cutting-edge therapies, Isabel stopped laughing. The tears that began rolling down her face were the first she'd shed in 2 years, since the accident that had confined her to that chair. What happened in the weeks that followed didn't just defy social norms. It revealed that sometimes the greatest miracles come from the simplest hearts. Villa Montemayor stood majestically on the hills outside Madrid like a castle of glass and marble, a silent witness to the power and loneliness that so often go hand in hand. This was where Isabel Herrera, 32, with a €3 billion financial empire, had chosen to isolate herself after the accident that changed her life forever. 2 years earlier, Isabel had been the most feared woman in European markets. As CEO of Herrera Holdings, she'd inherited a struggling company from her father at 28 and turned it into a giant dominating everything from real estate to tech. She was ruthless in business, brilliant in strategy, and completely alone in her personal life. She had no time for love, family, or anything that didn't generate profit or power. The accident happened during one of her usual high-speed drives in her Ferrari on the A6, heading home from a meeting that had ended with her acquiring a rival. A truck ran a red light, impact at 80 miles an hour, and Isabel's life shattered along with her spine. The doctors were blunt: paralysis from the waist down, no chance of recovery. From that moment, Villa Montemayor became a gilded prison. Isabel still ran her empire through video calls and assistants, but she'd fired anyone who showed her pity or understanding. She wanted efficiency, not compassion. Staff turnover at the villa was constant, everyone dismissed for daring to show even a hint of kindness toward the owner. Carlos Mendoza had taken the night janitor job out of necessity. At 38, he'd already endured enough pain for 3 lifetimes. His wife Elena had died of leukemia when their daughter Lucia was just 3, leaving him alone to face not only grief but the discovery that Lucia had been born with a rare form of cerebral palsy that doctors initially mistook for simple developmental delay. The early years were hell. Carlos worked construction by day and janitorial shifts by night to pay for Lucia's therapies. There wasn't a treatment he hadn't tried, a specialist he hadn't consulted, or a sacrifice he wasn't willing to make for his daughter. The miracle came when Lucia was 10. After 7 years of innovative therapies, daily exercises, and above all unconditional love that defied every prognosis, Lucia took her first steps. They weren't perfect steps, she still needed supports, but they were real steps doctors had called impossible. Now 12, Lucia attended a regular school with top grades and dreamed of becoming a doctor. Carlos had taken the night shift at Villa Montemayor because the hours let him be there for Lucia during the day. That December night, Carlos was finishing his cleaning when he heard a noise from the main living room. It was nearly midnight, and Mrs. Herrera usually retired much earlier. Concerned, he approached the door cautiously. What he saw hit him like a punch to the gut. Isabel Herrera sat motionless in her wheelchair by the huge window, not the physical stillness that struck him, but the expression on her face. For the first time since starting the job, Carlos saw past her icy mask. He saw pain, rage, and above all a loneliness so deep it reminded him of himself in the months after Elena's death. Isabel sensed his presence and turned with that weaponized glare. She said nothing, but her eyes clearly told him to leave. But Carlos, who'd spent years reading his daughter's silences when she couldn't yet communicate, recognized something different in that look. Behind the anger was a plea for help she might not even realize she was sending. Instead of leaving, Carlos did something completely unexpected. He walked over slowly, knelt before her wheelchair, and met her eyes with the same gentleness he used with Lucia in her toughest moments. The words that came out cut through the air like a blade, "I'll help you walk again." Isabel's reaction was immediate and fierce. She burst into cruel laughter that filled the room and bounced off the cold marble walls. When she finally spoke through the laughs, her voice dripped with sarcasm as she asked how a mere janitor thought he could do what millions spent on elite clinics hadn't. But Carlos didn't move, didn't look away, didn't flinch. He started telling her about Lucia, her difficult birth, the wrong diagnoses, the doctors who'd said impossible and never. He spoke of love that defied science, of nights spent massaging legs that felt like stone, of exercises repeated 1,000 times a day, of faith kept alive when everything seemed lost. And as Carlos spoke, something shifted in Isabel's face. The laughter faded, the sarcasm vanished, and for the first time in 2 years, tears rolled down her cheeks. They were tears of anger, frustration, but also of hope. A hope she'd buried under layers of cynicism and control, now resurfacing because of the words of a simple janitor who spoke with the wisdom of someone who'd turned the impossible into reality. The next morning, Isabel woke with a feeling she hadn't had in 2 years, curiosity. Overnight, she'd replayed Carlos's words, his calm certainty, the way he'd spoken of his daughter as if miracles were the most natural thing in the world. She'd also done something she hadn't in ages. She'd dug for information. Her personal assistants had worked through the night compiling a dossier on Carlos Mendoza. What they found left Isabel speechless. Carlos wasn't just a janitor, he was a man who'd spent the last 9 years studying every aspect of neuromotor rehabilitation. He'd taken night classes, trained online, read every scientific paper available, not for career ambition, but out of love for a daughter doctors had sentenced to lifelong immobility. The results spoke for themselves. Lucia Mendoza had become a case study at several Spanish universities. Her ability to walk, even with supports, was considered a medical anomaly that defied every prognosis. All because of a father who refused to accept the impossible. That night, when Carlos arrived for his shift, he found Isabel waiting in the main living room. She wasn't the broken woman from the night before, nor the ruthless CEO of old. She was something in between. Someone wrestling with whether to trust. Without preamble, she said she wanted to meet Lucia. Carlos explained his daughter was in school during the day but he could bring her on Saturday afternoon. Isabel's response surprised him. She wanted to see Lucia in her own environment, to understand how Carlos had done it. She wanted to leave the villa. It was an impossible request. Isabel Herrera hadn't left Villa Montemayor in 2 years. Everyone had tried to convince her to escape that gilded prison, but she'd always refused. The outside world reminded her of everything she'd lost. When Carlos voiced doubts about her readiness, Isabel flashed her old fire, reminding him she'd built an empire and could surely handle a visit. But both knew it wasn't true. Seeing Lucia walk could be as devastating as it was inspiring. Carlos made a decision that would change everything. He agreed, but with one condition. If she came to his home, she had to commit to starting a rehabilitation program. Not as a patient, not as a CEO, but as a person who wanted her life back. Isabel said she'd already tried Europe's best physical therapists and spent months in the most expensive clinics. Carlos gently interrupted. Those efforts had failed because she'd tried to buy a miracle instead of building one. The confrontation heated up when Isabel asked what he wanted from her. Carlos was direct. He wanted her to believe it was possible, to stop acting like her life was over, to treat her body with the same respect and determination she'd shown her company. Isabel's fear was palpable when she asked what would happen if it didn't work, if after weeks of trying she was still stuck in the chair. Carlos smiled with genuine hope and said at least she'd have tried, and he'd be there every night, reminding her she was far more than she thought. It was an absurd promise from a man with nothing to offer except his experience as a father and unshakable faith in everyday miracles. But in that moment, in the cold elegance of Villa Montemayor, Isabel Herrera made the bravest decision of her life. She accepted the challenge, warning that if he failed, if he just wasted her time and raised false hopes, she'd never forgive him. Carlos's reply was simple and powerful: he wouldn't fail, because she would be the one doing it. The following Saturday, Isabel left Villa Montemayor for the first time in 2 years. The drive to Carlos's modest apartment in Getafe was emotionally brutal. Every pedestrian reminded her of the freedom she'd lost. The apartment was the opposite of the villa: small, warm, filled with photos of Lucia and rehabilitation manuals. Lucia herself was a revelation. Not the fragile child Isabel expected, but a lively 12-year-old who walked with light supports and smiled with a light that brightened everything. Lucia immediately recognized Isabel's challenges and showed her some exercises. She described how it had been hard at first, how they'd turned every therapy session into a game, every movement into an adventure. Carlos had taught her the body was just learning a new language. Watching Lucia move with graceful, determined steps, something broke inside Isabel. This girl was showing her a courage she'd forgotten she possessed. When Isabel asked to try, Lucia made her promise never to give up. What followed was the most meaningful afternoon of Isabel's life. Lucia taught her how to wake dormant muscles. Carlos guided with skill and tenderness. When Isabel returned to the villa, she was exhausted but more alive than she'd felt in years. She said she wanted to start the next day, and every day after, no matter how much it hurt. Carlos smiled gently: "We'll see." The days that followed were hell. Isabel had faced financial crises and brutal legal battles, but nothing prepared her for the war her body was waging against itself. Carlos turned one villa room into a gym with simple but effective equipment he'd learned from years with Lucia. The daily battle began at 6 a.m. Exercises humiliating in their simplicity, millimeter movements, contractions of seemingly dead muscles. After a week of frustration, Isabel exploded, shouting it was pointless. Carlos kept going, explaining that Lucia had taken 6 months just to wiggle her big toe. When Isabel tried to excuse herself with age and medical diagnoses, Carlos stopped her, reminding her of the determination that had terrified European markets. The following weeks brought small victories and huge setbacks. Lucia turned weekends into moments of joy, teaching Isabel to befriend her legs instead of fighting them. After 2 months came the turning point. During morning exercises, Isabel felt something stir in her muscles. She called Carlos, trembling. When she managed a slight thigh contraction against his hands, they both cried with joy. It was only the beginning, but a real one. For the first time in 2 years, Isabel had proof her body wasn't dead, just asleep. 6 months later, Villa Montemayor was transformed. Cold rooms now buzzed with life, rehab equipment, progress photos, Lucia's drawings. But the biggest change was in Isabel herself. The woman who'd terrorized markets had learned patience. The CEO who tolerated no delays had accepted that miracles keep their own schedule. The billionaire surrounded by people paid to agree had discovered what it meant to be loved for who she was. Physical progress was slow but steady. Voluntary movement in both legs, returning sensation, standing with supports. More important were the emotional gains. She'd discovered she was capable of deep love, for Carlos, who'd become the partner she never thought she wanted, and for Lucia, the daughter she'd never had. One night, watching Lucia play in the garden, Isabel confessed she'd once thought the miracle would be walking again. Instead, she'd realized the real miracle was feeling alive. She'd returned to running the company with renewed passion, launching a division for rehabilitation research. But the greatest transformation was personal. Carlos and Lucia had moved into the villa as a family. When Lucia asked if the real miracle was becoming a family, Isabel confirmed with tears in her eyes. The accident she'd thought was the end had been the start of discovering that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in hearts that beat together. 1 year later, Villa Montemayor hosted an event no one could have imagined. In the same main living room where Carlos had first found Isabel motionless in her wheelchair, a wedding was taking place, not a lavish affair with hundreds of guests, but something far more precious, the union of two souls who'd found each other in their darkest moments. Isabel wore a simple white dress, seated in her wheelchair, which she no longer saw as a prison but as part of herself. Beside her, Carlos held Lucia's hand. She'd insisted on standing up for both of them. The officiant was the local parish priest, the same one who'd baptized Lucia and quietly supported their unconventional family. During the vows, Carlos told Isabel he'd never promised she'd walk again, only that she'd live again. Looking into her eyes, he knew they'd kept that promise together. Isabel replied that Carlos had saved her not from her disability, but from her fears. He'd taught her that love doesn't need working legs, it needs a beating heart. And hers now beat for him and Lucia. Lucia, who'd held it together like an adult until then, burst into happy tears, shouting that they were truly a family now and running to hug them both. Among the guests were villa staff who'd become family, patients Isabel now supported through her foundation, and even former colleagues stunned by the transformation of the woman they'd known as the Ice Queen of Finance. But the real celebration wasn't the wedding itself, it was what it represented. Isabel had learned happiness doesn't depend on what the body can or cannot do, but on what the heart is willing to give and receive. Carlos had discovered love can take forms he never imagined, and family can be born in the most unexpected moments. Lucia, now 14 and growing steadier on her legs, had become the bridge between two seemingly incompatible worlds. Her presence had taught Isabel the simple joy of little things, while showing Carlos that love can multiply without ever diminishing. After the ceremony, as guests celebrated in the villa gardens, Isabel and Carlos found themselves alone in the living room where it all began. She was still in her wheelchair. He stood beside her, but there was no distance between them, physical or emotional. Isabel said Carlos had kept his promise. When he asked which one, though he already knew, she explained he'd helped her walk again, not with her legs, but with her heart. And that was the greatest miracle she could imagine. Carlos knelt beside her, just as he had that first night when he'd promised to help. But now there was no desperation in his gesture, only infinite love. He gently explained the miracle was that they'd learned love doesn't have to be perfect to be complete. Lucia walked differently. Isabel moved differently. He loved differently than he'd imagined. But together they were perfect. That night, as Lucia slept in her new room at Villa Montemayor and the party sounds faded, Isabel lay awake thinking about the miracle she'd lived. She hadn't fully regained the use of her legs, and maybe never would, but she'd gained something infinitely more precious. She'd learned to love without conditions, to be loved without pretense, to find joy in everyday small victories. Herrera Holdings remained a thriving empire, but now guided by different principles. Isabel had created disability support programs for employees, invested millions in medical research, and turned financial success into a tool for social change. But at night, when she came home, she wasn't met with financial reports or market strategies. She was met by Carlos cooking dinner, Lucia doing homework at the kitchen table, a family that had chosen to love each other despite, or perhaps because of, their imperfections. The night janitor had kept his impossible promise. He hadn't made Isabel walk in the traditional sense, but he'd helped her take her first steps toward a life truly worth living. And in the process, he'd discovered that the greatest miracles aren't the ones that restore what we've lost, but the ones that help us find what we didn't know we were looking for. Villa Montemayor was no longer a gilded prison of loneliness. It had become a home where every day celebrated the miracle of love that overcomes every barrier, limitation, and fear. Because sometimes the real miracle isn't healing our wounds, it's learning to turn them into strength to love even more.